It is with great pleasure that I begin the final panel of the Evaluating the Claims About the End of Men. It's been a great 2 days, and I hope, I expect, I promise that this last panel will be a great ending to a great conference. And so just to give you a brief sort of preview of what's going to happen. I'll be speaking first. I'm Khiara Bridges, I'm a professor here. Following me to the podium will be Philip Cohen, then Frank Rudy Cooper, and then Nancy Dowd. And then we will have time for a colloquy, and we will take questions from the audience. So for the past 2 days, we've sort of I think we've done a pretty good job of evaluating claims about the end of men, and I think the weight of the opinion is that good news, guys, men are not actually ending. I think it's fair to say that the book might have been titled something along the lines of transformations and gender obligations and expectations in a particularly narrow swath of the population, but not quite as catchy. Might not have sold as many books. But nevertheless, if we define the end of men as a state of affairs in which women are not marrying men and are choosing to raise their children, if they choose to have them, outside of the institution of marriage, and the reason why women are doing this is because, one, men cannot find jobs that can support their families, and two, women can find jobs that can support their families or can otherwise support themselves independent of men. If that is how we're defining the end of men, then I think it's fair to say that poor black men ended a long time ago. And Serena Mayeri raised the point before yesterday, but this is precisely what Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan pointed to in his notorious report that he wrote in 1965 on the Negro family, right? So close to 50 years ago, Senator Moynihan observed that almost 25% of quote-unquote urban Negro marriages were dissolved. Right, almost 25% of quote-unquote Negro births were illegitimate, and almost 25% of Negro families were female-headed households. And he even noted the gender role reversal that had occurred among black families. But there's a very important difference between the way that the problem that Moynihan described almost half a century ago was talked about and the terms of the current debate around the end of men today. The female-headed family form in which men were absent and women were the only parental presence was pathologized, and viciously so, when it could be identified as a feature that was unique to the quote-unquote Negro family. In contrast, the language of pathology has not been used to describe this same family form as it has been replicated in the general read non-black population. And so the question then becomes why? Why pathologize the end of men when it happened to black people, but not pathologize the end of men when it is happening to a particular segment of non-black people? Well, I took a look at the Moynihan Report, so I got a glass of wine and I printed out and I need wine because I need a sedative when I read the Moynihan Report. And it extensively cites statistics demonstrating the disproportionate receipt by black female-headed black families of assistance from the Aid for Families with Dependent Children program, welfare. And so it got me to thinking that maybe dependence on the state is that which determines whether a phenomenon will be constructed as a problem and a case for national action, right, as opposed to a mere fact. Which is to say, maybe the end of non-black men has not been pathologized because there does not seem to be a threat that with men's demise, women will be turning to the state for assistance. In contrast, the end of black men was pathologized because women needed state assistance as a product of their demise, which made me think, well, how does the current program that assists women who are heading these female-headed families, how does Temporary Aid for Needy Families, TANF, how does TANF approach the end of men? So TANF is famous for many reasons, but two of the most salient aspects of the program is its dual emphasis on, one, incentivizing recipients to get a job, and two, incentivizing recipients to get married, right? It's the get a job, get a man paradigm. And so with respect to incentivizing beneficiaries to work, There is an unmistakable undercurrent in the legislation that pushes beneficiaries into the labor market. And so if a woman should answer the call of the statute, she will be the woman who is reflected in Rosen's Atlantic article and in her book. And so in that respect, TANF kind of embraces a model in which men have ended. And so the state refusing to assume the role that men assumed in a bygone era compels beneficiaries to become the women that Rosen assumes that all women will come to be in this rapidly approaching brave new world. Now, on the other hand, as strident as the calls are for women to get a job by TANF, as strident as those calls are the calls for women to get a man, get married. So when passing TANF, Congress presented the lack of marriage and the necessity that mothers parent outside of the heteronormative family as the reason why there are just so many dang problems in the U.S. to begin with, right? In the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act and the legislative findings, there's a whole slew of problems that are presumably brought about by the failure or the disappearance of marriage among the poor, and marriage is offered as the solution to these ills. And so the legislation lists a series of activities that states may do to quote unquote promote healthy marriage. All of which states may fund with TANF monies as opposed to giving those TANF monies to recipients to actually take care of their kids. Moreover, when TANF was reauthorized in 2005, the government reaffirmed its commitment to emphasizing marriage to TANF beneficiaries. The Bush administration increased federal funding for the Healthy Marriage Initiative, and through this initiative, through which $150 million are allocated each year, states can use community-based contractors to promote marriage through such avenues as couples counseling, marriage education, and media campaigns. And so if one just regards the marriage promotion piece of TANF, then the program would appear to be encouraging indigent women to become independent of the state by becoming dependent on a wage-earning man. And as such, the program would appear to disbelieve that men have actually ended. They appear to believe that men are very much alive. The program assumes that if the state campaigns hard enough about the benefits of marriage, then women and men will realize how beautiful and wonderful marriage is and will enter into it happily. And so when one reads TANF's emphasis on job promotion together with its emphasis on marriage promotion, one can perceive the program's ambivalence. It appears to be just as committed to men's end as it is to men's continued survival. But there is an argument to be made that even through its job promotion, even through its call to get a job, the statute assumes that indigent women can and should marry. So through its call to get a job, it nevertheless says, get a man under its breath. And so one can hear the call to marry within TANF's call to work by looking at the different ways in which women may satisfy their work obligations. And so the statute provides that a single woman with a child under the age of 6 months may be exempted from the work requirement. A single woman between the ages of, with a child between the ages of 6 months and 6 years is required to work 20 hours per week. Meanwhile, single mothers with children over the age of 6 years must work 30 hours per week. But things get interesting and illuminating when the legislation contemplates the married mother. Members of two-parent families must work together 35 hours per week. And intriguingly, the statute doesn't require that the parents evenly split the workload. The statute doesn't even require that both parents work. Instead, one parent may engage in all 35 hours of the requisite work while the other parent does not engage in work under the statute at all. Differently stated, the program allows one parent to work in the labor market for 35 hours and the other parent to stay home with the kids. And gender realities as they are, and how they have been historically, and as they are likely to be in the future, it's not illogical to assume that the statute presumes that the parent working will be the male and the parent staying at home and caring for the kids will be the female. And so, to sum up, even through the call to get a job, one can hear the call to get a man. And so it would appear that the authors of TANF do not appear to believe that the men that TANF beneficiaries would marry have ended. And remaining ultimately unconvinced that men have ended, TANF constructs indigent women's refusal to marry as a matter of personal choice. And it's not a coincidence that the name of the legislation that enacted TANF was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. If you got your personal issues together, you would go ahead and get a man, get a job, and stop turning to the state for money. And so, according to TANF, women have decided that for whatever misguided reason, they will not marry the marriageable men that are out there waiting to be found, even though marrying them is likely to lift them out of poverty or simply just make them happy. As such, the cause of the female-headed household among the poor can be located in individual decision-making and individual bad decision-making. In contrast, individual decision-making plays a relatively small role in discussions about the end of men phenomenon as it affects the general, read non-Black, non-poor population. Instead, structural forces or a changing economy are pointed to as causes of the female-headed household. And without a doubt, individual women are making individual choices not to marry given these structural transformations, but the structural transformations remain the focus of the debate, not quote-unquote personal responsibility. And moreover, the women who are choosing not to marry, given these structural transformations, are making rational choices not to marry. They could create a perfectly happy, self-fulfilling, self-sustaining life entirely independent from men. And it makes perfect sense for them not to marry. But in contrast, TANF offers the indigent women electing not to marry as making entirely irrational choices not to marry. Presently unmarried, they are mired in poverty, living off the government dole. Marriage, on the other hand, promises them freedom from indigence. Nevertheless, they remain unmarried. And so the question then becomes, what if the structures within which individual women decide not to get married were illuminated? What if it were revealed that, like their non-poor sisters, it is an entirely rational choice to remain unmarried? What if it revealed that the men that they would marry are being incarcerated, like positively warehoused, right? Massively incarcerated, that they're being disenfranchised, and as a result of their disenfranchisement, they're just not marriage material? What if that were revealed? Would the language of pathology disappear from the female-headed household as is reflected among poor Black families, or would good old-fashioned racism rule the day, and it will remain pathologized nevertheless? I have a theory, and my life's work is to prove myself correct, is that when behavior is demonstrated, the same behavior is demonstrated in Black folks, it tends to be the subject of scorn and pathology. Meanwhile, when it's demonstrated in folks with race privilege, it tends to be explained away as something outside of them. And so I'm curious as to whether, given that this end of men phenomenon is now beginning to affect non-Black people, whether we'll see that same, my theory, demonstrated once again. And that's the end of my comments. I would like to bring Philip Cohen to the stand.
How long? 12
to 15.
12 to 15.
And I'll give you
You'll give me the signal.
time on the.
Okay. Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Khiara, and thanks Linda and the organizers of the conference and all the people who came before us to present. It's been a great conference so far, and I'm glad there are still people here. Not including Hannah Rosen, which is fine. She had enough, she'll have to catch it all later online. I'm going to talk about the book in particular somewhat, but I also am going to try to talk a little bit more about the similar claims that sort of come from the general environment, not strictly from the book. And I want to make two points, two general points. One, and I'm going to do a lot of data in this talk, One is that women are not actually dominant. And this is pretty important because rather than just run through a lot of specific details and errors and distortions in the book, which I could do, and which I have, there's a number of them on my blog if you want to go look. I want to try to make the argument that the story is fundamentally wrong, not just that there's a lot of particular errors, right, in the way that information is presented and interpreted. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to establish that baseline, women are not actually dominant right now, and that's not surprising at this point in the conference, is that the theory for how we have gotten to this place, which we aren't actually at, is really very disempowering and sort of disembodying of how of us as how these things actually happen. It's not continuous and inevitable that women will rise, and in fact, what I'll show in the second half is how just how that's not happening. Okay. Number one, and this has achieved almost meme-like status out there. Young women earn more than young men, which is not true. This is just earnings by age, and it's pretty close there in the upper 20s among full-time workers, comparing all full-time working men to all full-time working women. The actual data that this comes from is really much more narrow than that. It is actually, when she says young men or young women, or when David Brooks, in quoting her, just says, young women earn more than young men these days. They're really referring to a study that was done that compared full-time, year-round working, never married, 22 to 30-year-old metro area workers with no children. And that is not a random collection of variables to select on, actually. It's really, if you really tried to find the group where you would expect to see the least labor market inequality, that's where it would be, right? Young people without the young people in which the women in the people never had the burdens of marriage or children, and they're working full time. But if you break those out by education, you quickly see that within each education level in that group, men are earning more. It turns out that group is selected in odd ways. There are a lot of Latino men in this category and a lot of white women. It doesn't make sense, and it's not true. Okay. Women are not taking over the middle class, number two. We really like, in this day and age, 50%. People like to call 50% a tipping point, confusing a tipping point with a milestone, right? A milestone is just a neat number that you might like to focus on. A tipping point is a point at which whatever trend you're talking about accelerates and starts to take on speed. Anyway, so if you massage the labor force data enough till you get to over 50%, you get this category, managerial and professional jobs. And it is true that women are more than half of the workers in managerial and professional jobs. This is part of how Rosen sees them taking over the middle class. But this category, as you can see, includes the 89% of women who are nurses and the 78% of women who are elementary and middle school teachers, as well as the 12% of women who are engineers, or the 12% of engineers who are women, I should say. So a lot of segregation in this category, and if you didn't include all those professionals, if you just had the managers, you would see it was a lot more male than that, especially the top executives, which includes the people who run small enterprises, by the way. That's why it's so high, 26% female. Okay. The other way that women are taking over the middle class is by taking over education. We know they are receiving the majority of many kinds of degrees nowadays. We learn in engineering and science, women are beginning to crowd out men. When she says beginning to, what it means is it's not happening yet, what she's saying, but it's moving in that direction. And again, here, what's missing is the segregation angle. If you look at the gender composition of people in their 25 to 39-year-old range, early to mid-career people, I suppose, who have these degrees, this is all engineering and science, and you can see that it includes 75% female in psychology and all the way down to 20% female in engineering. Okay. Within families, Somebody mentioned this picture yesterday, actually, this is from her New York Times Magazine excerpt. That's the woman standing next to the sad man who was sitting in the chair, I guess. Anyway, women earning more than their husbands has become more popular, but I would still classify it as kind of rare. 28%. Now, this number can be massaged a lot also, because if you include just women who are working full-time or just women who are employed, you can get this number up around 40%, but among all women, all married couples, about a quarter or over a quarter, or as she would say, about 28%, nearly a third, are earning more than their husbands. That's a real example from the book. I'm not just picking on her. Okay, the other way to look at this is women earning more than their husbands, instead of just looking at that cutoff, that 50% cutoff, are they earning more or not, is to look at the overall distribution. Here you can see the dark bars are 1970 all the way down to the light bars in 2010. This is the distribution of income within married couples, and you can see that back in the day in 1970, 46% of married couples, the wife earned none of the income, and that's all the way down to 18.7%. So that's the dramatic rise of married women's labor force participation. On the other end, you can see the dramatic increase in families in which the wife earns all the money. It's quadrupled from 0.6% to 2.3%. And that whole curve has shifted off to the right somewhat, but we really don't want to get too carried away with this. Okay. Also in the category of earning more than their wives, more than their husbands being kind of rare, is this idea that in marriage nowadays, marriage is totally changed by this dynamic. Because young women earn more than young men, when they start their married life, they're starting off with more income than their husbands. Single childless women under 30 make more. This means that among the elites especially, there's a high chance that a woman is making more than the man when they first get married. If you look at the people who just got married in the last 12 months, which the American Community Survey lets us do, you can see that 36% of the college graduates have income greater than their husbands the year after they got married. You can see how much higher that is among African American women, but still, they're only 44%. Okay. Okay, then she shifts gears and she talks about the virtual disappearance of sexual assault as part of women's empowerment. Partly because women are so economically independent that they're able to walk away from bad relationships. I hope that's true, but it has not caused a disappearance of sexual assault. There has been a big decline in sexual assault, whether both as reported to police or as reported on the National Crime Victimization Survey, which captures unreported crimes. But she says that it has declined so much that the rates are so low in parts of the country, criminologists can't plot the numbers on a chart. Which is, I guess, a dig at criminologists' ability to plot small numbers on charts. But anyway, I plotted these numbers on a chart. The interesting thing is, and there may be areas within these states that have very low rates. The state with the lowest rate of forcible rape per 100,000 from reported crimes is New Jersey at 11.2. That's more than twice the median rate of forcible rape reported for European countries. Okay, so we may be off the bottom of the chart in some, we're not. Okay, I can't make a joke out of that. Okay. Then she switches gears again and says, well, in fairness, this isn't such a great story after all. We should realize that now that women are seizing power, we're going to have more crime, more female violence and female crime, because she's not an essentialist and women actually are capable of behaving badly like men. The evidence for this is extremely weak. There is one trend which is upward, which is the number of arrests of female juveniles for violent crimes. But all the measures of actual violence show declines of female violence. So you can see female offenders per 1,000 women. This is from crime victimization surveys when they ask who victimized you. This has declined by about half just in the last 12 years, a slight upward increase in the percentage of violent crime committed by women, but not very much. And an extremely sharp drop in intimate partner homicide, but a much sharper drop among male victims than among female victims in the last, this is 40 years. Okay. Okay. This thing about Alabama being a place of female dominance, I have to just pause on. Women do not dominate Alexander City and Auburn, Alabama, and I can say that never having been there. And so The problem is that if the facts don't support the generalization, then the anecdotes are not illustrations of a trend. They're just little stories. She says suddenly it's who we are relying on the women. It's us who are relying on women. And she's quoting this man who was laid off. Suddenly we got women in control, and she adds, this year Alexander had its first female mayor. Well, actually, that female mayor, Barbara Young, was elected 8 years earlier. She's a very traditional Southern Republican politician. She's the widow of a state's attorney or some other politician. Her children are politicians. She's stepping down this year, and there are 5 men competing to replace her. So there will not be a female mayor in Alexander City next year. The city council has 1 woman out of 6. The department heads of the city are 14 out of 15 male. But more importantly, as far as the deadbeat men in her story, the young guy, you only know he's awake because the cigarette smoke starts coming out from under his door in the trailer park in the morning. The truth is, men in their 20s in Alexander City, 77% of them are employed, more than the women, 53%. I'm not saying the men are better than the women. It's just a pretty normal pattern. Employment rates are higher for men at all ages. The labor force is over 50% male. The high end of the earnings distribution is overwhelmingly male, and men earn more on average. Down the road in Auburn, she says it's one of the economic powerhouses. It's the region's economic powerhouse. It has turned itself into a town dominated by women. I have no idea how she can say this. The city council and the mayor, the department heads, the University of Auburn, okay, obviously, as you would expect, about 85% female. But more importantly, look at family income between husbands and wives. You can see 32% of the family of married couples, the wife earns no percent of the income, or under 10%, and about 2% does the wife earn over 20. So it's about the same as the rest of the country. The workforce is majority male. Women earn 70% of what men earn. Men are 70% of the managers, et cetera. It's not happening. This is not true. Okay. Okay, finally, and I'm going to run out of time before I do some of my trends, but I want to say this. She has this idea that the velocity of change is so great that it's unstoppable, and women will crash through 50% or equality and reach dominance just by sheer force of the rapidity of change. But the truth is, we're stalled and have been on many indicators for 10 to 20 years. So she says, and this is an important example, not just picking on her for being loose with the facts, women are now lead TV anchors, Ivy League presidents, bank presidents, corporate CEOs, movie directors, scatologically savvy comedians, presidential candidates, all unthinkable 20 years ago. Not only are those not unthinkable 20 years ago, those had all happened 20 years ago, okay? With the exception of Ivy League president, which was not until 1993, 19 years ago. So Marlene Sanders and Jessica Savage were anchoring the news. Shirley Chisholm and Pat Schroeder had major presidential campaigns. Roseanne Barr was pretty scatological. Penny Marshall was already directing her 4th feature film for Hollywood by 1992. Maggie Lena Walker founded a bank in 1902, et cetera. Okay. So, but the important point, that what's lost here in this idea of this unstoppable force is that it doesn't just happen. It's not just technology or economic change that moves us in the direction of gender equality, but there are other things that have to happen, things like politics and social movements and policy, right? So I think technology has given women a boost. But you can see here women's labor force participation hasn't increased since the late 1990s. Skip that one. The gender gap in pay had a big run-up in the 80s and early 90s and has trickled upwards since then, not very much. The gender gap by education shows that women with college degrees are doing worse compared to men with college degrees than they were 20 years ago. Segregation, the blue line is women without college degrees, no progress in 20 years. The green line is women with college degrees, some desegregation in 20 years, not much. The 70s and 80s are when this change happened. Women entering management, big increase in the 70s and 80s, virtually nothing since then. Okay, time is up. So let me conclude by saying we need to think more about why we're stalled than we do. Than we need to think about how far we've come, I think. to put it bluntly. And the problem, what I find problematic about the book and the narrative is the idea that all we have to do is sit there and watch women reap their gains. These are the mentions of feminism and the word feminist in the Google Books database, and you can see they both peaked in the 90s. We need to think about things like culture and politics and policy, and not just watch technology do its magic. Thank you.
Okay, I'm really pleased to be here. Obviously, I'm Frank Rudy Cooper. I'm in your program. I want to start by thanking the organizers of this, first Khiara, then also Kate and Kristen, and especially Linda. It's been really an interesting, provocative conference, and I just hope to make a little bit of a contribution to that. The way I intend to make a contribution to that is to talk a little bit about masculinities and hyperincarceration. And I'll say in a nutshell, this is my point. How can you possibly write a book about the end of men and not talk about hyperincarceration of men of color? It's a strange thing to me, and I have to say that a lot of the criticisms that Philip had, I have as well, in terms of a seeming sort of disconnection between some things that aren't, that are maybe good happening versus being able to call that a real trend towards women's equality. That seems like quite a stretch. All right, so I want to talk about masculinity's theory. So masculinity's theory, you can see I've sort of broken it down quickly here. Masculinities are concepts of what is manly. So what does that mean? Obviously there's a tautology in there, right? The reason that's so is because we are defining what is manly and what is masculine by both looking at, in culture, what seems to be masculine and manly, and then also by changing over time what seems to be masculine and manly. So there's a sort of circuit of culture that Stuart Hall talks about, and I want to talk a little bit about a sort of circuit of identity. And so we can think about masculinities as affecting self-identity, right? How do I see myself as a man amongst all the other identities that I see myself as? And this is obviously going to have some effect on behavior. But also there's attributed identities. So here I'm thinking of Carbato and Galati's idea of the idea that you can have an identity which is attributed to you regardless of how you think of yourself. And here we're thinking stereotypes, but also institutional structures are affected by masculinities. And here we're thinking about the stereotypes applied. And part of the reason to think of this as a circuit is, of course, I go with my self-identity to the law school, I look at my students out there, I make judgments about them, I am, in a sense, applying stereotypes to them, but then they do things to try and change that stereotype. So if I look at a student and I say, white male student, probably gonna be lazy. He's not going to stand still, right? He's going to try and perform his identity in a way that negotiates with my stereotypes of him. So he might sit in the front of the class. He might make it very clear that he's paying attention in class. He may ask questions. He may be a gunner. And this circuit works over and over again. So that's just to talk about masculinity and how it affects the circuit of identity. So next is to talk about the fact that there are hegemonic masculinities. And of course, Michael Kimmel wrote an excellent essay, Masculinity as Homophobia, that draws on this idea of there being a hegemonic masculinity. And the definition of hegemony, of course, is dominance by persuasion. And what I want to talk about here is, again, a Stuart Hall idea to bring culture back into it, or the sort of circuit of play around the idea of masculinity. There are messages about masculinity that are encoded. In one sense, we sort of make a message, and everything is a message, but especially some of the cultural images that we see are messages. And so one idea about masculinity that gets encoded is that men are breadwinners. But encoding is just sort of the message as it's put together, and then you might say there's a text, and then that text gets decoded. So if the text goes out, men are breadwinners, you can see from our TV shows, men are supposed to be the breadwinners, then that gets decoded by people so that we get some of the characters in Hannah Rosen's book saying, I'm failing as a man. I've decoded that message, I'm supposed to be a breadwinner, I'm not the breadwinner, I'm failing as a man, which is to say they're coming to conclusions about their own masculine identity. And then, of course, there are alternative masculinities. Just as an example, I threw, a sort of stereotype, right? Gay men dress well. Well, what we're talking about is segmenting masculinities into different subgroups and seeing how those men think of themselves and others. So, and mostly here we're concerned about how they think of themselves. All right, so multidimensional masculinities theory. So I've co-edited a book with Anne McGinley, who you saw yesterday, called Masculinities and the Law, a Multidimensional Approach. And and a number of folks here are authors in there, Fen and Naomi Khan, who is here, and Nancy Dowd, who's going to follow me. The idea is to look at masculinities and note two important things. One, that identities are intertwined. So I'm a black man, I'm straight, I'm class privileged, all at once. As the intersectionality theorists have been showing us for a long time, it does not make sense to say that I'm black and therefore you can just sort of suppress my masculine identity. My masculine identity may be invisible to others or to me as influencing my identity, but it is always working at the same time as my blackness and other aspects of my identity. They work together, and where that becomes especially important is that in different contexts, we're going to see different combinations of my identity that are going to be more salient over time in different places. And another way of thinking about this is that we sort of turn different facets of ourselves towards our audience depending on what we think is most important. Or internally, we feel different facets of ourselves to be more important in different environments. So in mostly white environments, my race tends to become more salient to me. In mostly female environments, my masculinity might become more salient to me, and so forth. And then the sort of methodology that we're suggesting with respect to masculinity is to keep shifting lenses and looking at things from different perspectives. So with that in mind, I want to look at the narrative about the end of men. And so this is a discourse that is being encoded about men's dominance coming to an end. So where do I see that? The old Christina Hoff Sommers book, The War Against Boys, the Heimowitz book, which was mentioned yesterday, Manning Up, and of course, The End of Men. There's about a dozen of these books now, just in the last couple of years, that are suggesting a war on boys, a war on men, the end of men, that men need to man up, that men are failing somehow, and that men's dominance is coming to an end. And I'm going to put these all together as a sort of war on men narrative. And I'm sorry, I have a cold, so I'm going to have to pause every now and then. So two things, I think, become really important here. Why isn't hyperincarceration mentioned in the book? And here I'm sort of figuring on some of what Rick Banks said yesterday. And I'll actually get back to what Rick Banks said yesterday at the end of my presentation. And then I think that I have some idea why this isn't really important to Hannah Rosen in the book, and that's that Hannah Rosen has written another long article where she talks about how Section 8, which spread poor people, read racial minorities, to the suburbs, thereby spread crime to the suburbs. That is, racial minorities equal crime. And so if you think racial minorities equal crime, it makes sense to think, well, that's not part of the end of men when we see that there are these incredible rates of incarceration of men of color. That's just the criminal justice system operating neutrally. So, and here I'm thinking at this point, so does it make sense to look at this as Hannah Rosen does, that black men are sort of miner's canary? Right, so yes, right? The crisis for black men, as a number of people have mentioned, including Khiara just now, precedes white men's crisis, if there is such a crisis. But there's two problems here with looking at it that way that I see. One, it suggests that our problems only matter when it happens to whites. And so there is definitely a strand of that in the book that I'm concerned about. But the second thing, and some people disagree with me, but I think canaries have to die in order for you to notice them. And I don't want us to have to die in order for people to notice, like, oh yeah, there used to be these people called black men. All right, so the narrative that I need to talk about then, of course, is the war on drugs, because that's what's causing hyperincarceration. And I'll make the point here that we have Ronald Reagan, a sort of quintessential manly man, and he's manly in a couple of ways when he declares the war on drugs in 1982. He certainly already has been come to see as a strong, aggressive, masculine sort of leader, but also being tough on crime is something that politicians fight over, not just because it moves votes, or rather because it moves votes, and the reason it moves votes is because it is seen as masculine. As people mentioned yesterday, leadership looks masculine. And so one way to be masculine is to be tough on crime, and Reagan's sort of biggest way in which he was tough on crime was to declare a war on drugs. So two things to note that I put at the bottom of the slide here, and hopefully you can see them. One is that there were 2% of the population that thought that the use of illicit drugs was a big problem when Reagan declared his war on drugs. And second is that people knew that Reagan was talking about racial minorities. As a number of scholars have discussed, there's been a law and order narrative that's been running at least since Nixon, and which is part of a Republican strategy and tied in with the Southern strategy, which is to essentially, I would argue, recode black people as criminals and then say, I want to fight criminals, right? And when you say you want to fight criminals, you have that one step removed that allows you to say that you are not being racist. But we know that the strategy was born in the 60s because of a concern on the part of whites, especially Southern whites, about the rise of black people. And as people joked yesterday, there is no end of white people that has ensued. So the explosion in incarceration, this graph, I just want you to note the way that our incarceration has gone since 1982, the war on drugs. So we see this sort of gentle incline, and then we see a steep mountain of incarceration. And I didn't include this slide in this version of the presentation, but you know, we are way out of step with the rest of the world. So depending on who you look at, we can see that maybe the second country in the world is Russia, and the third is Rwanda or South Africa. We certainly think of Russia as not being a particularly egalitarian society, and we think of those other societies as potentially being crime-ridden for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into here. But to shift lenses a little bit, I've talked mostly about race, let's get back to masculinity. What's going on in terms of the incarceration? Well, we've got the racial nature of it, and then we've got, skipping ahead, hyperincarceration as gendered as well. All right, and hyperincarceration, if you can see in this chart, it's a little hard to see, the bottom, the lowest line, the green line, is the incarceration rate for women. The red line is incarceration rate in general, and the blue line, incarceration rate for men. I don't claim to have a good grasp on statistics. I just want to use this illustratively to say, look, this is not just a racial problem, it's a men of color problem. And so, what does it look like? And what are the implications of this? So what it looks like is a bunch of black men stripped naked being processed mostly by, not entirely by, white men. And so two things I think that hyperincarceration, or what I call a war on men of color, means. One is routinized attacks on your dignity. And secondly is this sort of implication of an intra-gender warfare. So a person who I think is probably the best on this is Loic Wacant, the sociologist, and he talks about the fact that it's actually not just race and gender, but it's even more targeted than that when we look at how the war on drugs has resulted in hyperincarceration. It's men of color in inner cities who are poor. And so I just want to end on this note. These attacks on dignity are going to happen to these targeted populations. Why don't we care? And if you'll indulge me with 30 seconds. Thank you. So why no concern about men of color? Well, I'm thinking of what Rick Spanks said yesterday. As a society, we don't imagine black people as us, right? And so when we think about this whole idea that there's a war on men, we don't think, oh, that war that happened to men of color was a war on men. And if we're going to move forward, as I would like to suggest, that we have to require those people who are claiming that there's a war on men to extend their sympathy to men of color. Thank you.
I'm very glad to be here and to have a voice in this dialogue. And you will see that there's a lot of interconnection actually between Khiara's presentation and Frank's. Actually all of ours, because I think we're all critics of the book, as many people have been. The end of men assumes a beginning, men's prior place of power and privilege. And to assume that is true of all or most men ignores significant differences among men. It makes the end of men argument one that predominantly, if not exclusively, focused upon white, middle, and upper class men and women. It ignores a fundamental aspect of male dominance, that it is not only about the relationship of all men to all women, but just as importantly, it is about the relationship of men to each other. By rendering this hierarchy invisible, Rosen excludes those men at the bottom of the male hierarchy, suggesting a false, or at least a limited perspective on men's position as a whole. Her argument, therefore, I believe, reinforces male hierarchy by ignoring persistent subordination that benefits only those men at the top of the patriarchal heap. The end of men recasts hegemony. So one of its most serious shortcomings, then, is its essentialism, particularly its essentialism about men. Male hierarchy is raced, class, and gendered on the basis of sexual orientation. At the bottom of male hierarchy are black males. Their disadvantaged position is reflected in virtually every measure: health, education, employment, income, overall well-being. All of the most reliable data consistently indicate that black males constitute a segment of the population distinguished by hardship, disadvantage, and vulnerability. And one of the most powerful and horrific statistics is the hyperincarceration statistic. That 1 in 3 black males, 1 in 3 black males will experience incarceration in their lifetime. And this pattern begins much earlier in the juvenile justice system. Presence in the juvenile justice system, particularly at the deep end of the system, at incarceration, has harsh consequences. Going forward, it links to very highly negative employment and education statistics and the likelihood of a fragile family structure. It also predicts for further involvement with the adult criminal justice system, although some juveniles are being transferred over early into that system. But working backwards, it connects to an even more disturbing picture. So working backwards again from this, the pattern we see in the juvenile justice system. The so-called helping systems, those we have in place to help and support children, not only are inadequate, but appear to be actively funneling Black boys, in particular, into an end result that will lead to lost opportunity on a massive scale. If we were to construct a normal developmental trajectory for children and young adults and compare that to the life course of Black boys, it is not a picture of support and resources devoted to individual development and movement toward adulthood. Rather, it appears to be a systematic effort to undermine and subordinate. So I would like to sketch this briefly and challenge you to keep Black boys in mind. Imagine, if you will, that this is your son or your brother. So let's start with this newborn baby. This baby will have a 1 in 3 chance of being born into poverty, twice the chance of white children. And the impact of this cannot be underestimated. It includes hunger, poor nutrition, inferior health and education outcomes. Poverty impacts early development, which is critical to later functioning. Poor children are less likely to develop their cognitive and academic skills, and they therefore enter kindergarten at a disadvantage. They're unlikely to have high-quality childcare or be going into good schools that might attend to or eliminate that gap. Our 2 primary helping systems for young children in poverty are welfare for income support and the dependency or child welfare system to deal with issues of family breakdown, neglect, and abuse. Both are racialized systems that provide inadequate services, and in the case of child welfare, arguably exacerbate bad outcomes for children. The median benefit, the TANF that was talked about in the first presentation today, the median benefit for a family of 3 is approximately 1/3 of the poverty level, and it is time limited. So this is not a system that raises children out of poverty. And as with the income support system, the child welfare system is very racialized as well. Remember that the primary problem that we deal with in the child welfare system is neglect, not abuse. In other words, system involvement is linked to poverty. Black children are approximately 15% of all children, but they are 31% of the foster care population. And the disproportion to white children increases dramatically in cities. In Chicago, for example, 80% of the foster care population children are Black. This same disproportion does not exist for Asian or Latino children. Separation is simply more common for Black kids. It seems they are more easily removed from their families. And they are removed into a system that does not generate good outcomes for children. Arguably, it makes them worse. So this lack of effective positive intervention early in children's lives would make school the most powerful system in their lives that could affect their future opportunities and development. Instead of fostering growth and providing support, it is an institution that is particularly harmful for Black boys. So the pattern of disproportionate racial outcomes in the first years of life becomes a raced and gendered outcome at school. Black males are more likely than any other group to be punished, typically through some form of exclusion, labeled, categorized for special education, often without apparent disability, and to experience academic failure. In fact, the failure is so pervasive that it appears to be the norm and so does not raise any alarms. Black males are physically marginalized in basements, detention centers, special classes, and psychologically and socially isolated. Separation reinforces failure. It does not cure either behavior or academic achievement problems. The racial achievement gap is persistent, and even more disturbingly, it begins early. It is measurable by age 3, and I have seen some work that says it's measurable by age 2. It does not get better once children start school. So we then would not be surprised that at the other end, dropout rates are disproportionate by race, and the high school graduation rate for black boys is 52%. So 1 in 2 of black boys who go into the education system will not graduate from high school. This achievement gap seems particularly linked to stereotypes about black boys' capabilities, what one scholar identifies as the 5 Ds: dumb, deprived, dangerous, deviant, and disturbed. They are disproportionately disciplined, and this begins, we had a statistic earlier today about preschool, but there is a very high rate also in elementary school. And it rises in particular at 4th grade, what one scholar calls the 4th grade phenomenon, when young black boys begin developmentally, physically, to begin to look like young men. And we have to remember that discipline is criminalized. That is, the arrest of students often occurs for behavior that in the past would have been dealt with within schools. So then where black males become, again, disproportionate is in the juvenile justice system, not just because of arrests at school, but on the streets as well. And at current incarceration rates, again, 1/3 of African American males will experience incarceration, not system involvement, but incarceration at some times in their lives. And if they are black males of low socioeconomic status, that rate doubles. And changes in the juvenile justice system have been in the direction of harsher punishment, more incarceration, despite the lack of empirical data to support the effectiveness of those outcomes for public safety, recidivism, or rehabilitation. The shape of the juvenile justice system, its focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation, I believe is linked to its objects, which historically it is really a boys' system. It has been focused on boys as its objects, although certainly there is a rising percentage of girls in the juvenile justice system. It is still overwhelmingly populated by boys, just as in the adult criminal justice system is a men's justice system, and again, a disproportion of boys of color that we then see replicated in the adult system that Frank has been talking about. Victor Rios's brilliant study of urban black and Latino boys in Oakland tells us about a vicious cycle producing hypermasculinity and then criminalizing it through constant surveillance. Rios names this the youth control complex, a system in which schools, police, probation officers, families, community centers, the media, businesses, other institutions systematically treat young people's everyday behaviors as criminal activity. So the boys are defined as criminal for any form of transgression or disrespect of authority. So what does this promote in the boys? An over-conformity to aspects of masculinity. Toughness, dominance, the willingness to resort to violence to resolve interpersonal conflicts are all classic aspects of masculinity. Again, an over-conformity by these boys in response to, again, the oversight, the surveillance of their everyday activities. So their behavior then runs into a collision course with a criminal justice system that demands passivity, compliance, and conformity to a subjugated, racialized social status. So the lifetime opportunity consequences of this are particularly evident in employment. So black boys are disproportionately likely to begin their work in jobs with poor work conditions, low wages, and job instability. The chances for upward mobility are slim. And none of this is lost on black boys in the sense of their self-awareness and sense of powerlessness. This is not cardboard boy or cardboard man. disadvantage is not by choice, but by design, the design of systems and cultural stereotypes that are treated as norms. The systems implicated in the context of black boys do not work for anyone. In order to address the near extermination of opportunity for black boys, we not only need to eliminate disproportionality, but to demand positive outcomes based on evidence-based programs that serve children's needs, limit confinement, and foster resilience and opportunity. If we're going to get beyond the limitations of the end of men, we must insist on asking a richer set of questions. The inequality most lost in the way that the questions were asked in this book and the assumptions that drove the answer is the essentialist error. And particularly, it renders race invisible in the name of gender. I would want to suggest that there's a couple of other errors as well. The error of neutrality, treating the world as if it's objective and neutral, and ignoring embedded ways in which structures and culture are racialized, gendered, and in other ways infused with norms and outcomes that reinforce hierarchies. And an error also of reconstructing equality as a flip, leaving hierarchy in place. And one final question I think we should ask is, who benefits from the end of men argument? I would argue the most privileged men have benefited, and its greatest harm is in rendering invisible the boys and men who have been subordinated historically and still under this claimed new gender order. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes worth of good old colloquy. So, so we'll start with, I see Kate Soball's hand. So if we can get her a microphone, that would be wonderful. Here it comes.
Okay, so I feel like this has been the lunch and dinner conversation the whole way through the conference, but I am really interested in how you reflect on why this thesis is so attractive, and what is it about this, not Hannah Rosen, but the whole concept and all this coverage in the media of the concept from different books. Why is this so attractive given given its demographic and sort of empirical weakness? Why is this so compelling, this narrative?
Actually, I'm going to take a stab at that, if you don't mind.
Please.
That's rude, but I'm going to take a stab at it first. I actually think it's because people don't think it's true. I don't think people think it's true. I think that, so I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking about how this phenomenon is kind of reflected in popular culture. And when it's reflected in popular culture, it's in alarmist sort of books like that. But then on TV, it's always in a sitcom. It's never in, like, the HBO Dexter Dark series. It's not Boardwalk, and people aren't dying at the end of these popular reflections of the end of men. It's always, haha, how funny, he's at home with the baby and she went to work. So I don't think that it's actually that threatening to people. I don't think that people actually believe it. And that's kind of why I think it's like a science fiction, like it's entertaining, but we don't really think aliens are going to come and take over the White House, right?
I would say that the big thing is, as my colleague Jeff Pokrack says, those who are privileged experience the imposition of equality as oppression. So it really answers a need for some people to sort of express that, hey, these changes are happening and they're hurting my feelings and they're taking things from me that I'm entitled to. So I think it's sort of really, it's addressing that need.
I think there's also, and I don't think these are mutually exclusive explanations. I think this also is part of, or plays into, or reflects partly the the continuing backlash against feminism, the idea that feminism overshot, demanded too much, that women who work full-time for pay are neglecting their children and so on. If you look at the attitude data, there's a really good paper by my colleagues at Maryland, Reeve Vanneman and his co-authors, that show that the trends toward approving of women's employment, of thinking it's okay if women work, of thinking, there's 4 of them, of thinking that women can be as good at politics as men. So these things that are in the General Social Survey, those really peaked in the 90s and leveled off after that. And that's about when we start talking more about ratcheting up the demands of parenting and trying to respond to the winner-take-all economy by by increasing intensity of time and energy spent on children, and that affects men, but it affects women also. And the idea of that women are selfishly destroying their families in pursuit of a feminist ideal is at least one strain of a popular thought.
I'm just going to say, I think it's sensational. You know, you see it and you go, what? So there's some pull of, you got to be kidding me. So so the title. I mean, I was saying, I think, what if it said, if the book was titled "The End of White Middle Class and Upper Class Men and the Rise of White Middle and Upper Class Women," and nobody would buy the book. It'd be like, well, who cares? Or maybe they would. I don't know. But I think when it's such a, it seems counterintuitive. It's intriguing. And the other thing is, I think it may have been Joan Williams yesterday who was talking about how we love to have this battle of the sexes thing going on, right? So as if that's what equality is about. So if I were a conspiracy theorist, you want to it's to get us all distracted. It's to keep our attention away from the things that are really important. It's to not make us pay attention to, as Frank was saying, why aren't we paying attention to the things that we really should be paying attention to?
Okay, so we have a queue going. Stephanie Kuntz in the back. I have Rick Banks over here. Marion Case. I don't know your name. Oh, it's Shoshana. Okay, why don't we, Shoshana, okay. And yeah, I got it, it's in here. So we'll start with Stephanie Kuntz, yeah.
Okay, I loved all the presentations, but I take issue with all those 4 answers. I think that they speak to different parts of it that may be correct, but as someone, and I think most of us here are passionate about being able to connect with real people when we describe our research. And I think you're missing something very, very real. And that is the white working class audiences I speak to, that whatever their racial and gender prejudices are not the racist ones who are simply turning their back on all of these changes, and certainly not the anti-woman thing that are turning their back on it. They are in pain, and there is tremendous sympathy for their pain from the women folk among them. They're worried about raising their kids in this. They see this. So I think that intersects in a way that it is very important that we give credit to when we answer these misconceptions.
Can we get a microphone to Rick Banks right there?
I talk too loud anyway. But we used to always tell my father he was talking too loud. Now my children tell me that. But to follow up with Stephanie, I was wondering in terms of the popularity of these issues. I mean, again, I am struck at how many of journalists across different publications and different settings, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times to Fox News to CNN. I mean, all of these settings find that when they feature stories on this whole set of issues, not just the end of men, but changing gender roles, issues about parenting, they get more clicks than when they actually feature more substantive stories. And it's unconnected to the real, whether there's a foundation to the story. So, my sense is that however wrong an account may be on the facts, it does provide an opportunity for people to explore issues that they are rethinking and that they feel conflicted about. about the role of men and women in society, about, is it, all sorts of things about gender relations. And so there's a sense that things are in flux at the level of values, more even than at the level of social reality. And so it's almost as though the discussion, the argument that society is changing in this way is really just a way to tee up the question of, how would you feel if your, if my niece wanted to marry this guy who's not working, right? Does that matter to me? And that's part of the same-sex marriage debate as well. I mean, it's the same issue there. And so that's just my intuition about it. I just wanted to see if that seems right. That people are trying to rethink their ideals and trying to interrogate or trying to, they're conflicted about their own values now because there's some sense that things are shifting a little.
I'm thinking that there have been, because I do a lot of work on fatherhood as well, and there's been a number of stories in the Times. I mean, I'm thinking the one relatively recently, it was like an op-ed almost, Who Needs Men? I mean, it was the craziest article I had ever read. It's kind of like, yeah, it was in the New York Times. And there were, yeah. So and that's another one of those like absolutely what, and so maybe yes, I do think it gets attention, and I think what Kate's question is, why is that so? What's the pull, and also why does that get the click, or how do we get the click for other things that we might wish to focus that energy and attention on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick answer.
Can we get a microphone to Marianne Case, please?
Oh, one thing about Stephanie's point about the real pain, I guess you could ask the question why this particular group's pain at this particular time, right? If lots of people, if we look at the end of men in the black community, on these same measures 30 or 40 years ago, why wasn't that a national crisis in terms of pain instead of a national crisis in terms of crime control and cultural values and so on? So part of that maybe speaks to. Again, not to deny that people actually experience this as pain and losing their jobs and so on, but maybe there's an iconographic sort of status of the white working class man as an American thing, and maybe part of what the middle class or upper middle class readers of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal who are reading this are sort of sitting back and thinking, boy, how things have changed. Our symbolic man is losing his place, and it's, it has a strong symbolic value that we see, for example, in elections all the time.
Yeah, and I would say also to Stephanie's point, these are people who are lamenting the loss of things that they weren't entitled to. And I understand that it's real pain, but they got the GI Bill, right, et cetera. They got affirmative action for whites for a long time. And so I want to have sympathy, but I'm having a hard time having sympathy with that. Because I think really what's happened is that they've been flipped and made to vote their sort of cultural anxiety rather than that something really has been taken from them. Doesn't mean they don't feel the pain. Mm.
I agree with that, and I think that Rick got to another piece, and that is the anxiety in middle-class families. But I would again like to really push this issue. I never, when I'm talking to a white working-class audience, talk about white male privilege. I talk about white male leverage.
Sorry, say that again?
Leverage. These white working-class guys who've been losing, who've been working their butts off, and who are really at the bottom of the hierarchy, except for being one couple of steps above black men. They're not going to wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, gee, I think I'll exercise my privilege today. But if you acknowledge the real oppression that does occur to them despite some of the extra advantages they've had, they can actually hear you when you explain that whiteness has given them extra leverage to get ahead of fellow workers in the hierarchy. So again, I would urge you just to think about that as we reach out to these people whom we want to win over, not alienate.
Marianne, So I hate to take the conversation down to the very specific from the very general, but I had a question for Philip, whose paper I loved. You may not know these statistics off the top of your head, but I understand quite well the difference between a tipping point and a benchmark or a milestone. But I wonder if you know what the evidence indicates is the tipping point into a pink-collar ghetto, into what you might call the poverty of feminization, not the feminization of poverty. So there are these professions, elementary school teachers, secretary, we can name them and they differ from culture to culture, that used to be all male, high status, masculine, and privileged, became over time predominant, became pink collar ghettos, predominantly female, feminized in terms of what the job description looked like in gendered terms, and lower paying. What is the tipping point where if there's a certain, it might be 50%, I don't know, but what is it?
The truth is, actually, it doesn't happen very often. So you named most of them. Most of the occupations that are gender segregated now have been gender segregated sort of from their, it's mostly an origin story rather than a change story. As far as with occupations becoming feminized, there aren't very many that have gone that direction. I think it's interesting. One of the interesting things in the book End of Men is about the pharmacists, and I think, and she draws off Claudia Golden's research on this and others. It is true that women have really come to be majority in pharmacy and also in veterinary medicine, and I don't think she's crazy about the reasons why. But I don't think we should think of that as women taking over those occupations or taking over the middle class. I actually think that what that represents is a lot of women who have who would otherwise be surgeons and rocket scientists and so on, who, given their ability in school and how well they do, choose those occupations which have become niches that are more friendly towards women's family family obligations and the kind of lives they want to lead or feel they have to lead. So I think what actually would happen is I don't see that this would be a sort of a march of progress of women taking over those occupations, but actually if we opened up or changed the norms and rules governing the other occupations those women would be qualified for, we'd see a decline in the percent female in pharmacy and veterinary medicine and an increase in brain surgery and oncology and so on. But I don't think it's not really the case that except for a few exceptions, that occupations are really having a flood of incoming women and then tipping in and becoming ghettos. If you look at the big increase in women's BA degrees, it's mostly been into majors that they already dominated. So you see majors going from 60 to 70% female or 70 to 80% female over the last 30 or 40 years, rather than big increases from 10 to 50% or 20 to 60%.
I'm talking about much longer time expanses, from 0 women to 95% women.
But that just doesn't happen. There's only 1 or 2 examples of that. Because
In the United States, there are different examples in different other countries.
Not too many. Not that I know of. I could be wrong.
Shoshana?
Hopefully I can be coherent with this because I'm trying to put together, when Frank was speaking about in 1982 this war on drugs, I was also thinking that there was inauguration of the sort of war on promiscuity and female promiscuity and the beginning of abstinence-only education. And I was thinking then in response to that question, that one thing is there hasn't been a lot of talk on the attack on sort of reproductive rights, reproductive autonomy of women, and that seems to be, has increased alongside this sort of war or the end of manhood. And that at the same time, there's been this, since '82, this multifaceted attack, whether it's on poor women's access to abortion, whether it's on abortion access generally, abstinence-only education, around controlling and containing women's bodies and women's sexuality. Okay. And it's just kind of an interesting in terms of thinking about this also as backlash, because there's also this sort of parallel attack and attempt to sort of, I see this as recontrolling women's sexuality. And so it's just was, I'm not sure what I guess my question is, does this sort of backlash idea, and it seems to have legs to me, that in some ways there's also this powerful way of trying to contain women, and one of the things that's very striking is, like, if you look at same-sex marriage and you do demographic polling, that there's a big age variance, but there's not when it comes to abortion, and young people, younger generations have more conservative attitudes. So it's unlike with same-sex marriage, where people in their 20s have much more progressive attitudes than people who are older. So, sorry, that's a lot of thoughts, but it does seem to me that there's profound backlash against women's autonomy, etc., and that I can't figure out then, it sort of seems awfully hard to square with this idea that men are really the ones who are becoming disenfranchised and losing power. So I guess that's a comment, a question, returning to this idea of backlash.
Yeah, I'm actually not surprised by the contradiction at all, that we entering an era in the quote-unquote end of men. Meanwhile, we have, the proliferation of attacks on women's bodies and women's control of their bodies. Ideology has never had to be coherent, right? The welfare queen can be both incredibly stupid as well as incredibly savvy, right? Many times we see these marriage of contradictions where it's impossible to make sense out of them. And so to attempt to make sense out of an era of the end of men, as well as an era in which women are being attacked and unable to control their own bodies, I think that, it might be there might be a backlash to it, but it might just be separate, forces in society acting simultaneously, and there's no way to make sense of it really from a logical perspective at all. So I want to get 2 questions in possibly before we end the conference, and I have my friend over here and Brandon Green. So.
Hi. So earlier today, Karen Rivers had been talking about masculinity, or men being anxious when they see women's gains, and then Philip, I'm not sure what you prefer. You were talking about the female stagnation in terms of our achievements, which is from your graphs at least very true. And I'm wondering, just in general, what the entire panel thinks is the next step for women, because it seems as if when we make gains, we make men nervous, which hurts us because they go back to their boys' club. However, we need to keep making gains. We're not even close to getting to equal. And so what ideas do you guys have to sort of effectuate that?
I'll take a little bit of a stab at it.
Big question.
I think it's a really important to note, and along with Shoshana's question, and a couple other people have mentioned over the course of the conference, concerns about what is also sort of a war on women's reproductive rights. I guess I would tend to sound the alarm along the lines of, saying that this is a war on women. And there has been some rhetoric like that in politics. Now, I don't claim that that alone will be successful. So as Stephanie Kuntz was saying, it may be that we can't always say this is a war on women and you're a misogynist, even if they are. That we have to find some other language as well. That's what I'm thinking off the top of my head.
I guess I would concur with the people over the course of the conference who have focused on masculinity, or masculinities plural, as an area that needs substantial focus in terms of how are we going to get closer to equality. And this also links back to Stephanie's comment about, to say that we're not at the end of men is not to say that there aren't examples of men's subordination. It doesn't also say that men don't still have privilege. So we have to be complicated, I think, and sophisticated about what we're looking at. So that's number one. And I think also, for me, one of the enduring ways to ask about equality is to follow Mari Matsuda's Ask the Other Question. So I think what's happened, particularly with this panel and a few others, is so if we think it's about gender, what else might it be about, right? And two of the things that have been the loudest answers, I think, in this conference have been class and race. So we need to attend to that as well. I guess that what that means in terms of concrete steps, I'm not sure. And to be aware that, again, two things can be true at the same time, right? So women may be certainly have advanced, but also they could be losing ground. It's not going to be simple. And maybe last but not least, I would say I think we need to focus on the most subordinated first, because that is the miner's canary. I think Frank is absolutely right about that. I don't want the canary to die. I argued with him, no, the canary doesn't have to die. We just have to pay attention, But that's not pay attention and then pay attention for the benefit of someone who has our identity characteristics, right? But to stay focused on the canary and get the canary healthy, because that is going to work to the benefit of all of us.
I think Joan Williams said yesterday she was tired of policy arguments. I haven't been doing policy arguments hardly at all. I'm not tired of it. I just don't know that much about it. But I do think it's profitable for us to think about how some of these problems are linked that we're talking about. And in particular, I think we can draw good connections between and problems that we have good awareness of, which include sort of work-family conflict problems, the rush day, the long day, the parenting pressure, and this rigid masculinity. Okay, the public is not overly worked up about that, but intergenerational mobility, sort of the opportunity structure, and gender inequality. And so I think if you think about, there are a few sort of obvious policy things we can do that would chip away at a bunch of those, and they are very difficult to achieve, but we may as well make a list. I would include shortening the work week, which is a way to kind of break the masculine normative thing about overwork. So you need some incentives for employers to not have people work really long hours. I would think that universal child care and universal health care would be things that would lighten the work-family conflict load, reduce the constrictions on men that would change their roles or allow them or make it more possible to change their roles in families, and increase opportunities for intergenerational mobility by equalizing some of the advantages that some families have over others. So I like to think about it that way, in sort of universalistic policies that could tie together problems that we are able to agree are real problems. I don't know if you know that's what you were asking, but.
And one last question.
My question was whether or not there's any thoughts about whether the sort of simultaneous either attacks or attempts to debunk various isms is less an attempt to be controversial or alarmist and more to sort of create like a sedative narrative effect. So the rise of President Obama means that racism doesn't exist. The end of men means that sexism doesn't exist. No excuses means that poverty isn't a reason why kids aren't achieving what they should be achieving, et cetera, because it seems to me that all of these things are sort of happening at the same time. And if you take all of those things for how they're displayed, it would mean that America is sort of this place currently of equal opportunity. So women can achieve whatever, poor people can achieve whatever, black people can achieve whatever, even though, and so we don't have to work on systems. And I was just curious if you guys had any thoughts about if that may be the case. So it's not necessarily an attempt to be controversial or alarmist, but rather to put things out in space that would paint America as like this beacon of opportunity.
Yeah, well, no, you want to go?
I don't know that I have a comment. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just going to say part of what ties all that together to me is sort of a Horatio Alger myth, except applied beyond class, right? That race can be overcome, gender oppression can be overcome, that class intergenerational rises are possible. So that's what comes to my mind. I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, but I think that's part of what we have to attack, this idea that, but for a little luck, you're on the verge of making it if you deserve it. But, it's just a little luck and you would make it. And if you don't, you must not have deserved it.
I'd like to know, you all are the lawyers and everything. Is it harder for African Americans to win racial discrimination cases now that we have a black president? Is it going to be harder for women to win gender discrimination cases if the end of men is in the headlines?
I think it's already hard.
Well, sure.
I think
But especially if-
Ann McGinley can probably answer that question, but I think the trend in employment discrimination cases is it's gotten harder and harder and harder for over the last 20 years, especially individual cases.
Is this working? Okay. It's very difficult to win race discrimination cases in front of juries. In front of judges. I mean, the judges are summary judgmenting them out anyway, which is a quick process. It's gotten to the point where what you win, if you win anything, is a retaliation claim. And what that means is if you fire them for complaining about race discrimination, you can win that claim if they had a good reason to believe that it was discrimination, even if the jury finds that it wasn't. So that's retaliation claim, though, is something that could happen that doesn't, you don't have to prove the race element. Same thing with sex discrimination. I think it's a little easier with some juries to prove sex discrimination than race. But I don't know if I can pin it on the fact that Obama, I think this has been for a long time, even before Obama, but I think now people use the fact that Obama was elected to show that there is no racism, as someone mentioned. But these cases are almost impossible to win.
Can I just...
It's not just Obama, but affirmative action. As soon as you had affirmative action, racism was over. So you don't need any extra help. You're already getting help. Just like you were saying, the advent of affirmative action means that racism's over. The advent of the end of men means that sexism is over. So everything's over. We're the land of equal opportunity. I think that makes, absolute perfect sense to me.
Well, I was going to say, and I think the one piece that, as I was sitting here trying to think of a good answer to your question, I think one of the commonalities is that brings all the isms together for me. Our rate of child poverty is just absolutely horrific. It should be a national embarrassment. It's 1 in 5 children, and that has absolute concrete consequences for those kids. So I guess if I were to start someplace, it would be we have to change that statistic. That has to change because there's no opportunity. I shouldn't say be totalistic and say none, no way, but it's awfully hard to pull out of that. That's a setup. It's an absolute setup. So that might be a place to bring all those pieces together and to counter to say, no, there isn't there isn't a you can pull yourself up and that opportunity is there. It's not there. And we've put that there. We put it in place by accident of birth. It's going to affect 20% of our children, and that's so stupid for us as a society beyond the fact that it's a moral outrage. And again, of course, it's disproportionate by race, but so I guess that would be my other place to focus.
I guess I should add that now that gays can get married in New York and Massachusetts, homophobia is over as well. So, anyway, I want to invite Linda McLean up to the podium to make a couple final remarks.
So first of all, let's have a round of applause for this panel. So I'm going to be extremely brief. I want to thank our dean. Where is she? Maureen O'Rourke, for sitting through this entire conference and funding this conference and supporting it. And I'm so grateful to have a dean like this, and we're very grateful here to you for her. I want to thank our wonderful speakers, the audience on a Saturday afternoon having you here. And I just want to say a couple quick things. When Kate and Chris and I sat down to think about this conference, and when Khiara came on board the next semester, what we hoped to do here is an evaluation, okay? An evaluation of a claim that was getting a lot of attention and break it down various ways. And I couldn't I don't think, speaking for all of us, I don't think we could be happier with the way these last 2 days have gone. This last panel was a kind of perfect capping of that. Nancy put it so well, saying, you know, are we talking about class? Are we talking about gender? Are we talking about race? Stephanie brought out the importance of, you know, not minimizing the issue of pain. I mean, we have this battle between, are people upset because they're losing their privilege, or are they really suffering, you know, because of various forces? And this, Khiara brought up the tension between structural explanations versus personal responsibility explanations. A lot of people have talked about why is there not similar empathy or sympathy for men of color, for boys of color, who do we care about, you know, who's being left out? And all of these are wonderful and important questions, like you know, so it's like, what's going on? That was what we were trying to get a handle on. What's going on in these claims? Why should we care? And what should be done about it? You know, those are the kind of things we're looking at. And someone said yesterday, when work disappears, marriage disappears, as William Julius Wilson talked about. Part of what these diagnoses are looking at is what happens to neighborhoods, what happens to communities, okay, and what happens to the society if there are these various things going on. So we can't really wrap that all neatly with a package and a bow right now, but I hope that all of us will continue to think about these issues and work on them. And let me just say quickly, if you're interested in any of the work that our wonderful speakers have done, just walk down to Kenmore Square at the Barnes & Noble, and they have a display table on our conference, and you can see Frank and Ann's book on masculinities. You can see all sorts of other books by people. And in 2 weeks or so, we should have tapes of these panels online, so you may not want to watch them again, but you may have friends who'd like to who weren't able to be here, so spread the word about that. And in about 6 months, we're going to have a published symposium issue of the BU Law Review. If you want to read the actual papers that come out of this proceeding, and we're also launching an online complement to the BU Law Review, an online version of it, that is going to have shorter pieces by some additional voices on this issue, and that's going to be kind of going on for several months. So there's a lot more to do on this, and I just want to thank everyone so much for making this conference a success, and thank all of you from all these different disciplines who came into this law school and helped deepen our understanding. Okay, thank you so much.